Let's come back and take a quick look at the allied hand and what we might want to do with it. And then let's go take a look at the Japanese hand. So to zoom in, so this is just stepping back from operational mode to sort of looking at the whole turn. One of the things that's good to do is when you start a turn is to look at the cards you've got and kind of think generally about how you want to use those cards. So obviously the operations we're going to use primarily in the Pacific. The one question that comes up is whether to make some sort of preemptive attack in the CBI, and we sort of already looked at Toenails as being a good card for that because it's got the +1 die roll modifier. There's one card that's probably better than that. Most operation cards won't have more than a 4 logistics value for, most military events won't have more than a 4 logistics value to be used with SEAC. So they won't offer you more activations than the Toenails card. But there is one Slim's offensive that activates SEAC for 6, which would give 2 more activations than we had when we were playing around with it a little while ago, and that actually reduces the risk significantly for the Allies. It gives you a much better chance to do some damage to the Japanese air, and so if you actually are fortunate enough to have Slim's Burma offensive in your hand, and your opening hand is the Allies, using that as a preemptive card in the CBI starts to look really interesting. But other than that, there really aren't cards that are too much better. They're pretty much all either the 4 logistics or less. I think I lied because I think actually Axiom is 5, but I think Slim at 6 and Axiom at 5 are the only 2 other cards in the deck that are better than a 4 for SEAC. Let's look really quickly at the 3 cards along the bottom here, the reaction, the resource, and the political card. So the skip bombing attack, the doing a little damage can be nice, but actually the bigger piece of this is reducing the Japanese ASP total by 1 permanently, and then also getting you an extra strategy card. The trick is you can only draw the strategy card if you play this as an event. And that's true for any card that has draw 1 strategy card on the bottom. You can only draw that strategy card, the extra strategy card, if you play the card for the event, not as an OC. And so we would want at some point to be able to react to a Japanese offensive and play this card, and when we played this card in reaction, we would then get an extra card into our hand that we could look at, and hopefully it might be another operation military operation that we could do something with. The PT boats, same thing. The PT boats eliminate the Japanese barge capability, which is relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, but it's because you can draw another strategy card here, it's well worth doing. So this is a card that the Allies will want to play at some point, and potentially earlier, because there's no particular reason to hold off playing this, and the advantage of playing the PT boats earlier would be that you draw the strategy card right away, and you then have that extra card in your hand to look at and say, okay, how does that extra card fit with the other cards that I've got? And then the Sextant Conference. So this is what's normally referred to as an ISR ender. So if you're in ISR, it gets you out of it. It's always nice to have one of those. So this is a card that we would like to play probably sooner rather than later as the Allies. The trick to this one is that it's got a bonus, the Allied player immediately receives 3 Chinese ground and 1 Allied air replacement step. And those steps have to be taken right away. They can't be saved up. We do have we can take a couple of the Chinese replacements. That's good. We can't take the air replacement yet. So whether you hold off until you actually have an air casualty to be able to take the air replacement, or whether you want to just go ahead and end ISR right away, that's a judgment call. But it's definitely nice to have an ISR ender in your hand. And that's one of the things that also makes for a good chunk of replayability in the game, is exactly when the two sides will have ISR. So let me take a step back. I'm talking more now about the campaign than the short scenarios. In the short scenarios, you do have the opportunity to play a 3-0C anytime to end ISR if you want to. In the campaign, you can't do that. So in the campaign, a huge question is when the ISR and the ISR ending cards come up, because each side will be in ISR at certain points during the game for a period of time, but when that occurs and for how long that occurs is going to be totally random based on the play of the cards. And so that's another thing that just dramatically affects how the game unfolds, because you have to play differently when you're under ISR. So, for example, one of the things that typically the Japanese will try to do is, because they're normally running ground offensives in the CBI, they'll try and get their Army air over in the CBI and their naval air in the Central Pacific with the fleet. So that way, when they're running a ground offensive, they can activate their Army air either offensively or in reaction over there. And when they're in the Pacific, and activating their Navy, they've got naval air there to activate with the Navy. So that's one of the strategies that you use to just, position yourself to not be quite so badly affected by ISR. So that's a quick sort of look at the Allied deck. Let's actually pull out the Japanese deck, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the bottom of the map and put the Japanese deck on the bottom of the map. All right. And let me just walk through the Japanese hand here. So the Japanese actually, and by the way, these were randomly drawn hands that I just pulled out last night. And they actually ended up being quite good because there's a lot of different things going on in them, which was what I was looking for. So Vice Admiral Kondo and Central Force are two great cards for the early going in the campaign. They're cards that you'd love to have in your hand on like turns 2 and 3 of the campaign. But they're also perfectly good cards for the 1943 scenario because they're good for running your Burma offensive because they're high logistics value cards. So those two will be nice for Burma. We've got Ichigo, which is a China offensive, and actually that's quite cool because if we come back up to the top, you'll remember that we already had this one China offensive in our future offensive queue and our future operation queue. And so each of those offensives is going to move the marker by 1. So with 2 offensives, if the Allies don't have a response to that, we're going to be within 1 of government collapsed. And if the China marker ever gets the government collapsed, that reflects not Japan actually conquering China, which really was logistically impossible, but it reflects China effectively being out of the war at that point. So it's a huge loss for the Allies, and in the campaign game it costs 2 political will if that happens, which is big. But in the 43 scenario, it costs 5 victory points, or it's worth 5 victory points for the Japanese, which is huge. And it's actually really worth 7 victory points because it because you also have the 2 political will loss, and each of those is worth a victory point. So the fall of China actually is worth a total of 7 victory points to the Japanese. So those China cards are really, really big for the Japanese. And let's talk a little bit more about China while we're on it, because there's 2 ways to move the marker on the China track. One is these EC offensive. So an EC offensive is just when you play a China offensive, that's an event card that gives you a China offensive. But the other way you can do it is you can play a 3 OC as an OC offensive in China. And there's a couple differences. One is with the EC offensives, that is, if you play this card, and one of these cards that says move the China marker, you can actually do as many of those as you have. There aren't that many in the game, and you can play them whenever you have them, whenever you want. There's no limitation. With an OC offensive, you have to have a 3-value OC card. It can be any card that's got a 3 OC value. You just say, that's your card play. You say, I'm going to play this for a China offensive. You can only do that in alternating turns. So in other words, if we were to do one of those this turn, which is turn 5, we couldn't do one on turn 6. We'd have to wait until turn 7 to do another one. So you're limited in how frequently you can play OC China offensives. And the other thing is you have to roll for success. And the way you do it is you look up here and you see these Japanese divisions in China, and right now it's on the 7 of that track. So what that reflects is gradual withdrawal of Japanese forces from China, because all of your ground replacements come out of China. And every time you take a ground replacement step in the reinforcement and replacement phase at the beginning of the turn, you're going to move this 1 to the left. And you can take a total of no more than 2 in a turn. So you can see pretty quickly, if you're taking 2 a turn, you're running out of units in China pretty quickly. So the Japanese, it's one of the many trade-offs in this game. The Japanese have to think about, do they really need those divisions from China, or should they leave them in China? So here's why it's important to keep them in China. When you roll for effectiveness of your China OC offensive, you roll against this number. So basically, with no modifiers, we would be needing a 7 or less on a 10-sided die to succeed. But it's more complicated than that, because you have to look over at the Burma Road status. So what we've got for a modifier is -4, and then we've also got an air unit in the China box, which will give us another one. And so we're going to basically be, instead of needing a 7 or less, we're going to need a 2 or less to have a successful OC offensive. So that's only a 30% shot. So you can see why one of the reasons that the Japanese want to take North India is not just because it's victory points, but if we have Burma Road closed and no hump, because basically to have the hump open, you have to have, you can see Jarhat is an air, there's a lot of air bases in North India, right? There's one at Lido, one at Jarhat, and there's one at Dhaka there too, underneath that air unit. So as long as one of those air units is in Allied control and in supply, the hump will be open. But if we can manage to take North India, which includes Dhaka there, which is tough but not impossible to do, then we close down the hump, and that means instead of having a -4 modifier here, we're a 0 modifier, and at that point it becomes a lot easier to have a successful OC offensive. So you can see that with 2 China event cards, we're really interested in playing those for the events, because it's worth 7 victory points if we can drive it all the way over there. So we've got 1 in FO, and we were lucky enough to draw an additional 1 in our first hand, so that's a great start. We obviously don't know whether the Allies have 1 or not, but I would say in the 43 scenario, as with all card-driven games, one of the really interesting questions is, do you play an event for the event, or do you play an event as an operation, right? That's a classic card-driven game dilemma, or trade-off. And it really depends a lot on where you are. So, for example, in the 43 scenario, I would almost always play, as either side, I would almost always play a China card as a China card, just because that 7 victory points is so huge. In the campaign game, if the Japanese get a China card early, turn 2 or turn 3, when they're really trying to move fast, do you play it as a China card, or do you play it as an offense? Do you play it to move units? It's much more attractive to, or at least you'd think much more seriously about playing it to move units. But in the 43 scenario, I would almost always play a China card as a China card. War in Europe is another example of that. So let's look over here. This is another political card. It's a War in Europe card. We're in 43, so it's worth 1 on the track. If we go down to the, there we go. So you can see where we are. This is the War in Europe track right here. We're right now in the -1 box. If the Allies can get it up to the +1 box, then their reinforcements become undelayed. And what that means is, if you go all the way over and down to the right-hand corner, you'll see they have a few reinforcements which are last turn's reinforcements delayed. They're basically they're this turn's. They're turn 5 reinforcements that aren't coming on until turn 6, right? But if you go back to the charts, if you open up the chart box and go to pick the Allied Reinforcement tab and expand that out a little bit and look at turn 6, you'll see that on turn 6 you got the Essex, the Bunker Hill, 2 CVLs and a CVE plus the 3rd Marine Division. That's a heck of a lot of reinforcements, and those won't come in with delay for War in Europe. Those won't come in until turn 7, and the turn 7 reinforcements won't come in at all. And again, turn 7 you got a bunch more. You got 2 more big CV groups and another battleship group. So if the Allies are able to move War in Europe by 2, which is possible because the Allies have got, if I recall correctly, they've got 3 cards that will move it by 2 and 3 cards that will move it by 1. And the odds of having one of those 3 cards that will move it by 2 in a hand of 7 cards at the start of the game, it's maybe 28-29%, I think, when I ran the calculation. So it's, there's not a bad chance that the Allies would have a card that could move War in Europe up here. And if those reinforcements come in early, it makes it a lot tougher for the Japanese to hold on to their objectives in the Central Pacific. So as the Japanese, playing that 1 War in Europe or holding it as a safety valve is something that you probably would want to do. The trick is, with War in Europe cards, you don't want to play them as War in Europe if you don't have to, or if you've got something else you want to do with them. So a lot of times what will happen is the War in Europe cards will get saved as long as possible, because you don't want to let the other guy know that you've got one, because if you play yours, early, he'll see you played yours and he'll play his to counter effect yours, right? Whereas if you hold off and you can get him to play his, if he has one, to play his for operations, then you can play yours, and particularly as the Allies, if you can get the Japanese to play theirs for something else, then you can play yours and, maybe make it to +1 and get the extra fleet. So it's a bit of a mind game, with War in Europe and with some other cards as well, in terms of who's going to play what first. Let's keep looking here. So I'm back over on this side of the map. I realize if I don't move something, you guys don't see when I shift the screen. So oddly enough, the Allies have an ISR ender, and the Japanese have a card to put the Allies into ISR. you'll notice if you look at it that it also has a draw one strategy card. So that's a card that the Japanese would be tempted to play for ISR, to play for the strategy card even with the Allies already in ISR. But the trick is, if the Japanese play it too early, then there's no ISR value to it because the Allies still have their ISR ender. On the other hand, if the Allies play their ISR ender before this gets played, then the Japanese can play this and put the Allies right back into ISR. So this is more of that mind game about who plays what first. So if you are, let's just go back up top. So if we're playing the Allies here, looking at Sextant Conference, on the one hand, we're tempted to play it relatively sooner to get out of ISR. On the other hand, we know that it's always possible that the Japanese might have another ISR ender in their hand, and so the timing on playing stuff is definitely a fun mind game. Then the Japanese also have two reaction cards here, and they're two different types of cards. So let's just talk about reaction cards briefly for a minute. There's a type of reaction card that's not shown here, which is just a straight up intelligence card. The Japanese have a bunch of code change cards that basically all they do is they allow you to automatically intercept when you play it. And they also have a draw one strategy card on the bottom. So when you play one of those in reaction, you get to draw another strategy card. So remember, we talked earlier about using the dice to determine if you've got intercept or if it's a surprise attack. Because basically all attacks start out as surprise attacks, and then either through the play of a card or through rolling intelligence dice, you can convert it potentially to an intercept, or if you're the Allies and you get lucky with the card, you can have a midway style ambush too. But there's only one. No, actually, there's two cards for ambush in the game. But the Japanese code change card allows the Japanese to automatically set the intelligence condition to intercept, which allows reaction. It's really nice to have one of those because there can be situations in which the chance of rolling intercept is a lot lower. You might think, for example, that having the big 3OC cards are good, but the thing about a 3OC card is you can move farther, but the other guy can also move farther when he reacts, and they're easier to spot. So they have much higher die roll ranges, much broader die roll ranges to be able to get intercept. Obviously, a bigger operation, there's more likely to be signals intelligence and stuff like that. So sometimes that one OC event can be really sneaky, especially if you play it as an OC, not as an event. You can dramatically reduce the other guy's chance of getting intercept, and maybe grab something that's a base you want without him being able to react to it. So it's nice in those situations to have a card that you can play that gives you intercept. So that's what the code change cards do. Another type of intercept card a reaction card that's not in the hand right now is the Japanese weather cards. There are 3 weather cards that basically cancel Allied offensives, and essentially the Allied offensive just goes back where it started. Both players lose their card. That's it, but it does stop the offensive. And if it was a really good Allied card, it can be a total pain in the ass for the Allies to have it typhooned out. Those are the 2 other kinds of reaction cards that aren't here. Let's talk about what is here. The counteroffensive is a particular type of intercept card. So it acts like the code change card in the sense that it provides automatic intercept. But what it does is, you'll notice it's got a logistics value. And often it'll have either a bonus or a special condition associated with it. So what you do is the Japanese would play this in reaction in the same situation that they would play a code change card to say, okay, I don't want to roll, I want to just automatically be able to react, so I'm going to play this and I've got intercept. And now the other thing is that the logistic value that basically they add to their HQ's efficiency rating, instead of adding the OC value of the offensive card, they add the logistics value of this counteroffensive. So it's usually going to be at least equal to, if not better than, the OC value of the card, because typically the logistics value will be 3 or 4. I think there might even be one that's a 5 logistics. So the Japanese can mount a sort of bigger reaction through one of these counteroffensive cards. And then there can be, like there are here, some conditions associated with them as well. And you'll notice this card also has a draw one strategy card at the bottom. So if you play it as the event in reaction, you can draw a strategy card to replace it. The other card over here is a sub-attack. Both sides have a bunch of sub-attacks. You have to read the text carefully because the sub-attacks are different. First of all, some sub-attacks occur after the offensive is over. Some occur before the offensive. So in other words, what it amounts to is before or after the combat results, right? And so it can make a difference if you've got one of the ones that you're allowed to roll before the combat results. You can actually hit somebody and reduce the combat power of the other side before the combat goes off. But more of them are after. And there's also, there's at least one that requires hitting an enemy unit that's not active rather than one that is active. So just like read your sub-card text carefully. You'll also notice that the die roll ranges and the number of steps lost vary too. This is the best one for the Japanese because there's actually a 30% chance of hitting 2 steps with it. The other ones I think are all just 1 step if I remember right. But anyway, so read your sub-cards carefully. So that's kind of a quick overview for the Japanese hand.